That old woman is the maid. My daughter-in-law told the cashier at Whole Foods without even lowering her voice. Please don't bother her with questions. She gets confused sometimes. The young cashier froze with her hand still resting on a paper bag filled with apples and fresh bread. I stood there holding a carton of eggs against my chest while people shifted impatiently behind us in line. For a moment, I honestly thought I had heard Vanessa wrong. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed softly, and somewhere near the floral section, a child was crying for candy, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat slowly pounding in my ears. Vanessa smiled politely at the cashier as if she had said something perfectly normal. Her manicured hand rested lightly on the handle of the shopping cart while she glanced at her reflection in the glass refrigerator doors beside us. Daniel stood next to her scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't correct her. He didn't even flinch. The cashier looked at me uncertainly. "Oh," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Ma'am. Not Mrs. Carter. Not her mother-in-law. Just some old woman standing silently beside the cart. I felt my fingers tighten around the egg carton. 68 years old, and suddenly I was invisible inside my own family. Vanessa handed over her platinum card with a cheerful little laugh. "You know how older people are," she told the cashier. "She likes feeling useful." Useful. The words settled over me heavier than the reusable grocery bags hanging beside the register. I used to own a bakery 3 blocks from the church Daniel attended as a little boy. I spent 22 years waking up at 4 in the morning to knead dough before sunrise. My husband Richard handled the books while I baked cinnamon rolls that people lined up for every Saturday morning. Back then, my hands smelled like sugar and flour instead of lavender arthritis cream. Back then, my son used to hug me every afternoon after school and beg for leftover blueberry muffins. I sold that bakery 12 years ago to help Daniel open his first marketing firm downtown. Richard had already passed by then. A sudden heart attack on a rainy Tuesday morning. One minute he was drinking coffee beside the kitchen window. The next, my entire life split quietly down the middle. Daniel had stood in my living room after the funeral promising me I would never be alone. "You're my mother," he'd said while holding both my hands. "We'll always take care of each other." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. The cashier handed Vanessa the receipt carefully, avoiding eye contact with me now. Vanessa thanked her with that polished country club smile she used whenever she wanted people to admire her. Then she looked over at me. "Evelyn," she said softly, the way someone might speak to hired help in front of guests, "can you carry the lighter bags?" I nodded because I suddenly couldn't trust my voice. Daniel finally glanced up from his phone. "Mom, do you mind grabbing the sparkling water from the bottom rack?" Mom. The word almost startled me. It sounded strange coming from him now, as though he only remembered who I was in brief accidental moments. Outside, the late October air felt sharp against my skin. The parking lot shimmered under pale afternoon sunlight, while shopping carts rattled across the asphalt. Vanessa walked ahead in high leather boots, talking about a charity dinner happening next weekend. Daniel listened carefully, nodding along as she described floral arrangements and seating charts. Neither of them mentioned what had just happened inside the store. Neither of them looked at me. I loaded the groceries into the back of Daniel's black SUV, while Vanessa adjusted her cashmere scarf in the passenger mirror. A gust of cold wind pushed silver strands of hair across my face. For a second, I caught my reflection in the tinted car window. I looked smaller than I remembered. Smaller and strangely tired. When did that happen? When did I become someone people introduced with embarrassment instead of love? The drive home passed quietly except for Vanessa discussing guest lists and caterers. I stared out the window at rows of maple trees glowing orange and red beneath the cloudy sky. We drove through neighborhoods where children rode bicycles down sidewalks covered in fallen leaves, and elderly couples carried grocery bags together without shame. My chest ached in a way I couldn't fully explain. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Something emptier. When we pulled into the long driveway of Daniel's house, I noticed the porch lights had already turned on even though it was barely 5 o'clock. The house looked beautiful from the outside. White brick, tall windows, black shutters. I helped choose every detail when Daniel bought it 6 years ago. I even paid for the marble countertops in the kitchen as a housewarming gift. Vanessa stepped out of the SUV first. "Oh, and Evelyn," she called casually while walking toward the front door. "We're having guests tomorrow night, so if you could stay downstairs after 7, I'd really appreciate it." Stay downstairs. Like a servant being asked not to disturb company. Daniel grabbed his laptop bag from the back seat without looking at me. Thanks again for helping with groceries, Mom. Helping. Another word that suddenly sounded different than it used to. I stood alone in the driveway for a moment after they went inside. The cold air smelled faintly like rain and chimney smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked behind a wooden fence. Through the large front windows, I could see Vanessa laughing as she removed her coat while Daniel kissed her cheek. They looked happy together, comfortable, like two people who belonged in the same world. And for the first time since moving into that house after Richard died, I realized something that settled deep into my bones with terrifying clarity. Vanessa wasn't ashamed of having an old mother-in-law. She was ashamed of me specifically. And somehow, slowly over the years, she had taught my son to feel the same way. That evening, I carried the grocery bags downstairs one at a time because my knees had been bothering me since the weather turned colder. The basement apartment had once been Daniel's game room when he was a teenager. Back then, the walls were painted dark blue, and his friends would spend entire weekends down there eating pizza and shouting at football games on television. Now the room held a small beige couch, a twin bed, and a narrow bookshelf with only half my things unpacked. The air smelled faintly like laundry detergent from the nearby utility room. I placed the milk in the little refrigerator beside the sink and carefully lined up the canned soup Vanessa preferred I eat for lunch instead of using the main kitchen upstairs. The first few months after Richard died, Daniel insisted I move in with them temporarily. He had looked genuinely worried standing in my empty kitchen while helping me pack boxes. "You should not be alone right now, Mom," he had said quietly. "Stay with us until you feel better." I remember how relieved I felt hearing those words. Grief changes the sound of a house. After 40 years of marriage, silence becomes unbearable. Every room in my old home reminded me of Richard, his coffee mug beside the sink, his reading glasses on the nightstand, the worn recliner where he used to watch baseball games every Sunday afternoon. I thought moving in with Daniel would make the loneliness easier to survive. I did not realize loneliness could follow you into a crowded house. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving around the kitchen while cabinet doors opened and closed sharply. Her footsteps were always quick and purposeful, even inside the house. She walked the same way she spoke. Controlled, efficient, careful not to waste warmth where she believed it was unnecessary. A few minutes later, Daniel came downstairs holding his laptop under one arm. "Hey, Mom," he said with a tired smile. "Do you have the extra phone charger?" "Top drawer beside the lamp," I answered. He nodded distractedly and opened the drawer without really looking at me. His face looked older lately. Fine lines had started forming around his eyes, and there was gray beginning to show near his temples. For a second, I saw the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms because he hated lightning. I used to rub his back until he fell asleep against my shoulder. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, he said while untangling the charger cord. "Vanessa made salmon." I smiled faintly. "That sounds nice." He lingered awkwardly near the door as if he wanted to say something else. Instead, he glanced toward the staircase. "About earlier at the store," he started quietly before stopping himself. My chest tightened slightly. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "What about it?" I asked. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Vanessa just gets stressed sometimes in public situations." She did not mean anything by it. I stared at him for several seconds without speaking. The washing machine hummed softly beside us. Somewhere upstairs, Vanessa laughed while talking on the phone. "Your wife introduced me as hired help," I said carefully. Daniel sighed immediately, the way exhausted people do when they believe someone else is creating unnecessary problems. "Mom, come on." She was joking. Joking. Such a harmless little word people use when they do not want to admit cruelty. I folded a dish towel slowly between my hands. "Did it sound funny to you?" Daniel avoided my eyes then. "You know how Vanessa is." "Yes." I was finally beginning to. He checked his watch quickly. "Anyway, we should head upstairs before dinner gets cold." Before I could answer, he walked back toward the staircase carrying the charger. The conversation ended exactly the way so many conversations had ended over the past few years. Quietly, uncomfortably, with me left standing alone, holding feelings no one wanted to examine too closely. During dinner, Vanessa spoke enthusiastically about an upcoming charity fundraiser at the country club. She wanted white orchids for the centerpieces instead of roses because roses looked cheap, under ballroom lighting. Daniel nodded supportively while scrolling through emails between bites of salmon. I sat across from them at the long marble kitchen island where three pendant lights cast soft golden circles onto polished countertops I helped pay for. Vanessa barely acknowledged me except to ask if I could iron table linens tomorrow afternoon before the event planner arrived. "You are so much better with household details than I am," she said lightly while sipping sparkling water. "I swear I would fall apart without your help around here. Around here. Not family. Not home. Just useful." I noticed then that the framed photographs lining the shelves near the fireplace had changed again. Years ago, there used to be pictures of Richard holding Daniel at Little League games. Christmas mornings in our old house. One photograph of me covered in flour inside the bakery kitchen while Daniel grinned beside me, wearing an apron too big for his small shoulders. Those pictures were gone now, replaced with professional engagement portraits, vacation photos from Napa Valley, and carefully staged holiday cards featuring Vanessa and Daniel in coordinated cream-colored sweaters beside fireplaces that did not belong to them. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice. But I noticed. Slowly, piece by piece, my life had been edited out of this house like scenes cut from a movie no one wanted to watch anymore. After dinner, I quietly washed the dishes while Vanessa and Daniel sat in the living room discussing guest lists. Through the reflection in the kitchen window, I could see them laughing together on the sofa. Young, attractive, perfectly matched. My hands moved automatically beneath warm water and lemon-scented soap. Plate after plate, glass after glass. The same hands that once built an entire life for my son, now trembling slightly while cleaning up after him in silence. Then I heard Vanessa's voice drift casually from the living room. "Honestly, Daniel, we cannot keep living like this forever." My hand stopped moving instantly. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Your mother downstairs," she replied softly. "People are starting to ask questions. People are starting to ask questions." Vanessa's words settled over the living room like smoke. I stood perfectly still at the kitchen sink with my hands submerged in warm water while the last dinner plate slipped slightly between my fingers. The house suddenly felt quieter than before, as if even the walls were listening carefully now. Daniel did not answer immediately. I could hear the soft tapping of his phone screen followed by the low hum of the television in the background. Finally, he sighed. "What kind of questions?" Vanessa lowered her voice, but not enough. "At the fundraiser planning lunch today, Melissa asked if your mother was living with us permanently." She paused briefly, and then she asked if we were converting the basement into staff quarters. Staff quarters. I stared down at the soap bubbles gathering around my wrists. For a moment, I remembered another kitchen entirely. My old kitchen on Hawthorne Avenue with yellow curtains over the sink and flour dusted across the countertops before sunrise every morning. Richard used to sit at the table reading the newspaper while I prepared cinnamon rolls for the bakery. He would look up over the edge of his coffee cup and smile at me like I was still the prettiest woman in Illinois even after 35 years of marriage. Back then, nobody would have mistaken me for hired help inside my own home. "Melissa is rude to everybody," Daniel muttered finally. Vanessa laughed softly. "That is not the point." Silence stretched between them for several seconds. I dried my hands slowly on a kitchen towel and kept my eyes fixed on the sink. "Daniel," Vanessa continued carefully, "we are trying to build a certain image right now. Your business is growing. We are hosting investors. Charity boards notice these things. A certain image." The words made my chest ache in a strangely familiar way. Suddenly, memories began surfacing one after another like old photographs floating to the top of dark water. 3 years ago, Vanessa stopped introducing me as Daniel's mother during business dinners. "This is Evelyn," she would say brightly before quickly changing the subject. 2 years ago, she asked if I could use the side entrance whenever her friends visited because the dogs get excited when too many people use the front door. Last Christmas, she moved my seat from the head of the dining table to the far corner beside the kitchen doorway because she wanted matching chairs visible in photographs. At the time, I convinced myself none of it meant anything. Small things. Modern things. Young couples like things differently now. That was what I told myself every single time another piece of my place in the family quietly disappeared. Upstairs, Vanessa continued speaking in the same calm voice people use when discussing furniture placement. "I am just saying we need to think long term." Daniel sounded exhausted. "What do you want me To do, Vanessa? She is my mother. I know that. Her voice softened immediately, and I have been incredibly patient. But this arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Temporary. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard had been dead for almost 4 years now. For years of trying not to take up too much space inside a house my own savings helped purchase. For years of carefully folding myself smaller and smaller so I would not inconvenience anyone. She barely even comes upstairs anymore, Daniel said quietly. Exactly, Vanessa replied. Does that not strike you as unhealthy? I almost laughed at that. Unhealthy. As if isolation had been my idea. As if disappearing had happened naturally instead of gradually being taught to me through hundreds of tiny humiliations no one else would ever notice. I turned off the kitchen faucet and quietly placed the last clean plate into the drying rack. Through the reflection in the dark kitchen window, I could see Vanessa leaning elegantly against Daniel's shoulder on the living room sofa. Beautiful blonde hair, cream-colored sweater, perfect posture. She looked like the kind of woman magazines described as effortlessly graceful. People probably admired her everywhere she went. Maybe assisted living would actually be good for her socially, Vanessa said gently. Somewhere with activities. Friends her own age. Assisted living. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because of fear exactly. Because suddenly everything became painfully clear. The grocery store. The basement. The photographs disappearing from the walls. The careful introductions. The lowered voices whenever I entered a room unexpectedly. None of it had been accidental. Vanessa was not trying to make me feel welcome. She was preparing to erase me entirely. Daniel remained quiet for so long that I finally looked toward the living room doorway. He sat leaning forward now, with both elbows resting on his knees while staring at the hardwood floor. Older, tired, weak in ways Richard never was. I cannot just force her out, he said finally, though even he sounded uncertain. Vanessa touched his arm softly. Nobody said force. Her tone remained calm and reasonable. But eventually she is going to understand this situation cannot last forever. I looked down at my wedding ring then. I still wore it every day even after Richard passed. The gold band had grown loose over the years because grief changes the body in strange ways. Some women lose weight after loss. Others lose sleep. I think I lost solidity. I became lighter somehow. Easier to move around. Easier to overlook. Upstairs, Vanessa stood from the couch. Anyway, she said brightly, her mood suddenly shifting. We still need to finalize seating arrangements tomorrow. Her heels clicked softly across the hardwood floor as she walked toward the staircase. Daniel remained sitting alone in the living room after she left. For one brief moment, I thought he might come into the kitchen. I thought maybe he would finally see me standing there quietly in the shadows of his beautiful house. But instead, he picked up his phone again and stared silently at the screen while I carried my folded dish towel downstairs to the basement room that no longer felt temporary at all. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my bakery years. Old habits stay inside the body long after life changes around them. The basement room was still dark except for the soft blue glow of the digital clock beside my bed reading 5:12 a.m. For a moment, I forgot where I was. In that brief, sleepy haze between dreams and reality, I expected to smell cinnamon dough rising in the kitchen or hear Richard clearing his throat while starting the coffee maker upstairs. Instead, all I heard was the low hum of the furnace pushing warm air through vents above me. I sat up slowly and wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. October mornings in Illinois always carried a certain heaviness before winter arrived fully. Upstairs, the house remained silent. Vanessa would not wake for another 2 hours. Daniel usually left for work by 8, carrying expensive coffee in polished travel mugs while speaking into wireless headphones about investors and quarterly projections. Sometimes when I listened from downstairs, I struggled to connect that confident businessman with the boy who once cried. Because he thought thunderstorms sounded angry. I walked quietly toward the small dresser beside my bed and opened the bottom drawer where I kept the few things that still felt completely mine. Old photographs, birthday cards, Richard's watch, a faded bakery receipt from our first week in business back in 1984. I picked up the photograph resting on top of the stack. Daniel was 7 years old in that picture, missing his 2 front teeth and grinning proudly while standing behind the bakery counter beside me. Flour covered his cheeks. Richard had taken the picture after Daniel insisted on helping glaze donuts before school. One day this place will belong to him, Richard used to say proudly whenever customers complimented how polite our son was. Back then, our entire world fit inside that little bakery on Hawthorne Avenue. We worked 6 days a week. Some months we barely made enough money to cover utilities after payroll and supplies. But we were happy in the simple, exhausted way people become when they build something together. I still remember the winter Daniel got pneumonia at age 10. Richard and I took turns sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed for 4 nights straight because neither of us could bear leaving him alone. I remember cashing out part of my retirement account years later when Daniel wanted to launch his first company after business school. "I just need one chance, Mom," he had told me while sitting at our kitchen table surrounded by loan paperwork and rejection letters from banks. Richard had already been gone by then, but I could almost hear what he would have said. Help him. So I did. I sold the bakery building 3 months later. The smell of fresh bread lingered in those walls for weeks after closing. Sometimes I still dream about locking the front door for the last time while snow fell softly across the empty parking lot outside. Daniel hugged me afterward with tears in his eyes. "I will never forget what you did for me," he promised. Funny how certain promises fade faster once people begin living in bigger houses. Around 7:30, I went upstairs to iron the table linens Vanessa requested for the fundraiser dinner. Sunlight poured through the large kitchen windows, reflecting against spotless marble countertops. Vanessa stood near the stove wearing cream-colored workout clothes while scrolling through her phone. Even early in the morning, she looked polished in a way I never quite understood. "Good morning," I said quietly. She glanced up briefly. "Oh, good. You are already awake." Not good morning back, just acknowledgement. I plugged in the iron near the dining room table while she continued reviewing guest names. "Please be careful with those linens," she said without looking at me. "They were imported from Italy." I nodded silently. Steam rose softly from the iron as I smoothed wrinkles from white fabric embroidered with tiny silver patterns along the edges. The room smelled faintly of coffee beans and expensive candles. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone. "By the way," she said casually, "during tomorrow night's fundraiser, it might be easier if you stay downstairs after dinner starts." My hands paused slightly on the linen. "Easier for who?" I asked gently. Vanessa blinked as if surprised by the question. "For everyone." Her voice remained pleasant. "Some of the guests are important clients of Daniel's. It is just better if the evening stays professional." Professional. I folded the finished linen carefully before answering. I did not realize mothers were considered unprofessional now. Vanessa sighed softly, already irritated. "Evelyn, please do not make this difficult." There it was again. That calm, polished tone she used whenever she wanted me to feel unreasonable for noticing my own humiliation. "Nobody is trying to hurt your feelings," she continued. "But appearances matter in certain social circles." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Perfect blonde hair. Diamond bracelet catching morning sunlight. Smooth, flawless makeup before 8 o'clock in the morning. She was beautiful in the same cold way luxury hotels are beautiful. Elegant. Expensive. Impersonal. "You know," I said quietly while folding another linen napkin. "When Daniel was 23, he slept on my couch for nearly 8 months because he could not afford rent after losing his first job." Vanessa's expression tightened slightly. I continued calmly. "When his car broke down, I drove him to interviews myself because he could not afford repairs. And when he wanted to start his company, I sold the only business his father and I spent 30 years building." The kitchen grew very still. Even the refrigerator hum seemed louder suddenly. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "I know you helped him," she said carefully. "We are all grateful." Grateful. Such a neat little word. I placed the folded napkin onto the growing stack beside me. "No," I replied softly. "You are embarrassed." Vanessa opened her mouth immediately, but no words came out. For the first time since moving into that house, I watched uncertainty flicker briefly across her face. Just for a second. Then it disappeared beneath the same polished composure she always wore. "I think you are being overly sensitive," she said finally before turning back toward her phone. Sensitive. Another harmless little word people use when they want older women to stay quiet. I picked up the last linen from the basket and continued ironing in silence, while sunlight slowly filled the room I once believed would always feel like family. The afternoon before the fundraiser, Rain pressed softly against the basement windows while I sat at the small table beside my bed sorting old paperwork into neat stacks. Utility bills, insurance forms, greeting cards from neighbors who stopped visiting after I moved in with Daniel and Vanessa. I had spent most of the day downstairs after our conversation in the kitchen because suddenly the entire house felt different to me. Not hostile exactly, just honest. Once people stop pretending, the truth settles into rooms very quickly. Around 3 o'clock, I heard the front doorbell ring upstairs, followed by Vanessa's heels crossing the hardwood floor. Voices drifted faintly through the ceiling, too muffled to understand at first. Then footsteps approached the basement stairs. I looked up just as Daniel appeared at the bottom, holding a cardboard box against his chest. "Hey, Mom," he said distractedly. "Can I store some old files down here for now?" Old files. Everything unwanted eventually. Found its way downstairs. "Of course," I answered quietly. He placed the box beside the washing machine without really looking at me. His phone buzzed almost immediately. He checked the screen and sighed. "Vanessa is losing her mind upstairs over flower arrangements." I smiled faintly. Some things never survive being imperfect. Daniel laughed softly at that, but it faded quickly. He glanced around the basement room for the first time in months, really seeing it. The narrow bed. The tiny television balanced on milk crates. My winter coat hanging beside exposed pipes. "You doing okay down here?" he asked suddenly. "Down here? Not at home. Not with us. Just down here." "I am fine," I replied automatically. He nodded with visible relief, already ready to leave. Then his eyes landed on the old photograph beside my coffee mug, the one of him in the bakery kitchen missing his front teeth. For a brief second, his expression softened completely. "Wow," he murmured quietly while picking up the picture frame. "I forgot about this. You used to insist on frosting every donut yourself," I said. "Most of them looked terrible." Daniel smiled genuinely then. Not the tired business smile he used during phone calls upstairs. A real smile. Familiar. Young. Dad got so mad because I kept eating more frosting than I used. Richard. We had not spoken his name together in months. The room grew strangely still around us. Daniel continued staring at the photograph. "I miss him," he admitted quietly. Something inside my chest tightened. "So do I." He placed the picture back carefully. "You know," he said after a long pause, "sometimes I still think about the bakery." "Do you?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Honestly, those were probably the happiest years of my life." The words surprised me more than they should have. Happiness is rarely recognized while it is happening. Usually people only understand it after they lose access to it forever. Upstairs, Vanessa called his name sharply from somewhere near the foyer. Daniel flinched almost immediately. "I should go help," he muttered. "Of course." Before he turned away, I spoke quietly. "Daniel." He stopped halfway to the stairs. "When did you become embarrassed of me?" The question hung between us so suddenly that even he looked startled. Rain tapped steadily against the basement windows. Somewhere upstairs, Vanessa moved furniture across hardwood floors preparing for tomorrow night. Daniel stared at me silently for several seconds. "Mom," he said finally, sounding exhausted already. "That is not fair." "Fair." Another careful word. "Is it not?" I asked gently. He rubbed both hands over his face. "Nobody is embarrassed of you." I looked around the basement room slowly. "Then why do I live down here like something people are not supposed to see?" Daniel opened his mouth immediately, but nothing came out. His eyes moved toward the narrow bed beside the utility sink, toward the storage shelves stacked with Christmas decorations and old paint cans surrounding my little corner of existence. I watched guilt flicker across his face before he buried it quickly beneath frustration. "Vanessa just wants things organized," he said weakly. "Organized." I almost smiled. "Daniel," I said softly, "I spent 30 years cleaning flour off bakery floors before sunrise. I know the difference between organization and shame." His shoulders stiffened slightly. Upstairs, Vanessa called his name again, louder this time. "I cannot do this right now," he muttered while heading toward the stairs. "People are coming tomorrow." And there it was. The real priority. Not my feelings. Not the truth. The fundraiser. The image. The performance. Before disappearing upstairs, he paused one final time without turning around. "You know, Vanessa does not mean things the way they sound sometimes." I stared at the empty staircase after he left. The rain outside had grown heavier now, streaking water across the tiny basement windows in crooked silver lines. For several minutes, I remained perfectly still beside the table. Then slowly, I stood and walked toward the cardboard box Daniel brought downstairs earlier. The lid had not been taped shut properly. Inside sat dozens of business folders mixed with loose paperwork and old mail. I only meant to straighten the stack before moving it against the wall. Nothing more. But as I lifted one thick folder, near the top, a document slipped sideways onto the floor beside my feet. My eyes immediately caught the address printed across the top. Daniel's house. Beneath it sat words that made my stomach tighten instantly. Property title transfer consultation. I bent slowly and picked up the papers with trembling fingers. Vanessa's name appeared repeatedly throughout the document. So did Daniel's. Mine did not appear anywhere at all. Upstairs, muffled laughter echoed faintly through the floorboards while I stood alone in the basement staring at paperwork connected to the home my own savings helped buy. And for the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt confused about what was happening around me. I finally understood that Vanessa was not waiting for me to leave willingly. She was preparing for a future where it looked as though I had never belonged there in the first place. That night, I waited until the house became completely quiet before opening the folder again. Around midnight, the upstairs lights finally shut off one by one. First the kitchen, then the hallway. Finally the bedroom at the end of the second floor where Daniel and Vanessa slept beneath Egyptian cotton sheets in the master suite I helped furnish years ago. Rain still tapped softly against the basement windows while I sat at the little table beside my bed wearing my reading glasses and holding legal papers with slightly trembling hands. Property title transfer consultation. Preliminary ownership restructuring. Asset protection review. The language sounded polished and harmless at first glance. But underneath those clean professional phrases sat one simple truth. They were planning for a future that did not include me. I turned another page slowly. Daniel's signature appeared near the bottom beside Vanessa's elegant looping handwriting. My stomach tightened immediately. Not because they met with lawyers. Adults handle finances every day. That was not what hurt. What hurt was realizing they did it quietly. Carefully. Like people moving furniture in the middle of the night, so nobody notices something important disappearing. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes slowly. Suddenly, I remembered the afternoon Richard and I signed the original paperwork for this house 6 years earlier. Daniel had just gotten engaged to Vanessa then. The housing market was competitive, and the down payment stretched far beyond what Daniel could comfortably afford while growing his company. I still remember sitting beside Richard's old oak desk in my attorney's office while sunlight poured across stacks of paperwork. "Are you sure?" my lawyer asked gently at the time. "This is a substantial amount from your retirement savings." I smiled back then because the answer felt obvious. "It is for my son," I told him. I sold the bakery for Daniel. I emptied retirement accounts for Daniel. I even gave him the insurance money Richard left behind because I believed family worked like roots beneath trees. Invisible maybe, but permanent. Looking down at those transfer papers now, I realized roots can be cut quietly too. The next morning, I carried the folder upstairs before anyone woke up and returned it carefully to the storage box near the laundry room. My movements felt strangely calm. Not numb exactly. Clear. For years I kept convincing myself things would improve if I stayed patient enough. Kinder enough. Smaller enough. But once you finally see the truth clearly, pretending becomes exhausting. By noon, the entire house buzzed with fundraiser preparations. Catering trays arrived through the front door. White orchids covered nearly every surface downstairs. Vanessa moved quickly from room to room holding her clipboard while speaking into a wireless headset like the manager of a luxury hotel. "No, the champagne glasses belong near the West Bar setup," she instructed one employee sharply. "And somebody please move those extra chairs before guests arrive." I stayed mostly downstairs after lunch, folding napkins and polishing silver serving trays because nobody explicitly asked me not to help. Old habits again. When you spend your entire life taking care of people, usefulness becomes instinctive. Around 4 o'clock, I carried a stack of freshly pressed napkins upstairs toward the dining room when I heard voices coming from Daniel's office down the hallway. The door remained slightly open. "I am just saying the timing matters," Vanessa said quietly inside. "If we wait another year, things become more complicated." Daniel sounded tense already. "I know." "Then stop avoiding it." Papers shuffled across the desk. I stood motionless near the hallway table holding folded linens against my chest. The lawyer already explained the refinance options, Vanessa continued. Once the title structure changes, everything becomes cleaner legally. Cleaner legally. I stared down at the embroidered napkins in my arms. Daniel lowered his voice. What if she finds out? A long silence followed. Then Vanessa laughed softly. Not cruelly. Calmly. Confidently. Daniel, she said gently, your mother barely even looks at financial paperwork anymore. Something cold settled deeply into my chest then. Not sadness this time. Not humiliation. Understanding. Vanessa never saw me as family. She saw me as temporary. Old. Emotional. Easy to manage. Upstairs, Daniel sighed heavily. I just do not want drama. Neither do I. Vanessa replied immediately. That is why we are handling this carefully. Carefully. Another elegant word people use when they are doing something ugly politely. I stepped backward quietly before either of them noticed me outside the office door. My hands remained perfectly steady while carrying the napkins downstairs again, which surprised even me. I expected anger. Tears maybe. Instead, I felt something much quieter. Like a door inside me had finally closed completely. Back in the basement, I opened the small metal filing cabinet beside my bed for the first time in over a year. Most of the drawers contained old tax records and insurance documents from my bakery days. Near the bottom sat a thick manila envelope labeled simply in Richard's handwriting. House Trust. I stared at those words for several seconds before pulling the envelope out carefully. Dust coated the edges from years untouched. Richard always handled long-term financial planning after retiring from accounting. Just in case, he used to say whenever I teased him about organizing paperwork too carefully. I sat down slowly at the table and opened the envelope beneath the warm yellow light of my bedside lamp. Inside rested copies of trust agreements, ownership documents, and handwritten notes covered in Richard's neat block lettering. My eyes moved quickly across the first few pages before stopping completely on one sentence near the center of the document. The property ownership remains permanently protected under Evelyn Carter's controlling interest and cannot be transferred, refinanced, or restructured without her direct written authorization. I read the sentence twice more just to be certain. Then a third time. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa greeting arriving staff members while crystal glasses clinked softly throughout the house. But downstairs, sitting alone beneath exposed pipes and basement windows streaked with rainwater, I finally understood something neither Vanessa nor Daniel realized yet. They had spent years treating me like somebody powerless because they assumed age made people weak. What they forgot was this. I may have been quiet. I may have stepped aside. But Richard trusted me with everything before he died. And the house above my head still belonged more to me than it ever would to either of them. By 6:30 that evening, the house no longer looked like the place where I once helped Daniel unpack his first dishes after moving in. It looked like a showroom designed for strangers. White orchids filled crystal vases across every table. Candlelight reflected softly against polished marble countertops, while jazz music drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. Catering staff moved quickly through the kitchen balancing silver trays, filled with miniature crab cakes and sparkling champagne flutes. Everywhere I looked, there were details meant to impress people who had never struggled for anything important in their lives. I stood quietly at the bottom of the basement stairs wearing a navy blue dress I had not touched in years. Richard bought it for me before a charity auction nearly a decade ago. You look elegant in blue, he told me that night, while fastening my necklace himself because my arthritis had already started bothering my hands. I almost did not wear the dress tonight. Part of me thought perhaps Vanessa would prefer if I remained invisible entirely. But another part of me no longer cared what Vanessa preferred. Around 7 o'clock, guests began arriving steadily through the front entrance. Men in tailored suits. Women with smooth voices and expensive handbags. Their laughter floated easily through the house, while valet attendants parked luxury cars outside beneath cold October skies. From downstairs, I could hear Vanessa greeting each guest with flawless warmth. So glad you made it. You look amazing. Daniel has been looking forward to tonight all week. She sounded perfectly at home upstairs, like the house itself belonged to her completely. Eventually, I climbed the staircase slowly and stepped into the kitchen carrying an extra tray of champagne glasses because one of the catering girls looked overwhelmed. Several guests stood nearby, discussing investment portfolios and winter travel plans while soft golden lighting warmed the room around them. For a brief moment, nobody noticed me. Then Vanessa turned around. Her smile froze instantly when she saw me standing there. Not dramatically, just enough. Evelyn, she said quickly while crossing toward me. I thought you were resting downstairs. Resting? Such a polite replacement for hidden. I was helping, I replied calmly, setting the tray onto the counter. Vanessa lowered her voice immediately. The catering staff already has everything under control. I noticed then that two women standing nearby had stopped talking entirely. Both watched us carefully while pretending to examine the floral arrangements. Of course, I said softly. I did not mean to embarrass you. Vanessa's expression tightened for one brief second before smoothing perfectly again. Please do not start tonight, she whispered. Start. As if humiliation begins only once the injured person finally notices it. Before I could answer, a tall silver-haired man approached from the dining room, holding a champagne glass. Daniel, he called warmly across the room. You never told us your mother was here. Daniel looked up immediately from a conversation near the fireplace. For one quick second, uncertainty crossed his face. I watched him decide how to introduce me. That hesitation hurt more than anything Vanessa ever said. This is Evelyn. Vanessa answered smoothly before Daniel could speak. She helps us tremendously around the house. Helps us around the house. The words settled quietly between us while nearby conversations softened almost imperceptibly. The silver-haired man smiled politely toward me. Well, it is nice to meet you. I held his gaze calmly. Likewise. Vanessa touched his arm lightly. Evelyn keeps everything running beautifully for us. There it was again. Not mother. Not family. Useful. Helpful. Background. Around us, guests resumed sipping champagne while pretending not to notice the tension tightening the room. Daniel stared down into his drink without speaking. I looked at him for several long seconds before answering carefully. I suppose paying for most of the house does count as helping. Silence arrived instantly. Not dramatic silence. Worse. The kind where people suddenly become very interested in their glasses because they are unsure whether they just heard something inappropriate or important. Vanessa blinked at me slowly. Daniel's face lost color almost immediately. Excuse me? Vanessa asked with a brittle little laugh. I smiled faintly. The marble countertops were my gift actually. Richard and I also contributed significantly toward the original down payment. The silver-haired man glanced awkwardly toward Daniel now. Nearby conversations had nearly stopped completely. Even the catering staff seemed quieter somehow. Vanessa recovered first. She laughed softly while shaking her head. Evelyn likes to exaggerate family stories. Exaggerate. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. Do I? Daniel finally stepped forward quickly. Mom, he said under his breath. Not tonight. Not tonight. Meaning later perhaps. Meaning privately. Meaning hidden where truths cannot embarrass anyone publicly. I looked around the beautiful room slowly. At the white orchids. The imported linens I ironed yesterday. The polished silver trays reflecting candlelight. Every elegant detail built carefully to impress strangers, while the woman who helped create the foundation beneath it all was expected to remain. Downstairs out of sight. Something inside me settled completely then. Not anger. Certainty. Vanessa's smile had become visibly strained now. Why do not you sit down for a while? She suggested gently. The way people speak to elderly relatives they hope will stop talking soon. You must be tired. Tired. Another small word meant to reduce older women into manageable things. Before I could answer, the front door opened again and cold autumn air swept briefly through the foyer. A man stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase while removing rain droplets from his coat sleeve. Tall. Gray-haired. Familiar. My heartbeat slowed instantly the moment I recognized him. Arthur Bennett. Richard's attorney for nearly 20 years. Vanessa turned toward him immediately, visibly confused. Can I help you? She asked politely. Arthur glanced around the crowded room before his eyes landed on me, standing beside the kitchen island. His expression softened at once. Mrs. Carter, he said warmly while crossing the room toward me. I apologize for arriving unannounced. Daniel stared at him in shock. Vanessa's posture stiffened immediately beside the champagne table. Arthur held the leather briefcase firmly against his side before speaking again in the calm, steady voice attorneys use when they already know exactly how conversations are going to end. There are several urgent matters regarding the property trust that require your immediate attention. The room changed the moment Arthur Bennett spoke the word trust. It was subtle at first. Conversation slowed. Champagne glasses paused halfway to smiling mouths. Somewhere near the fireplace, a woman lowered her voice in the middle of a sentence and never finished it. Wealthy people recognize legal language the way sailors recognize storm clouds. Arthur stood calmly near the foyer holding his leather briefcase, while rainwater darkened the shoulders of his charcoal coat. He looked older than the last time I saw him after Richard's funeral, but his posture remained perfectly straight, precise, controlled. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. Vanessa recovered first. I think there must be some misunderstanding, she said smoothly while stepping forward with her polished hostess smile. Tonight is actually a private fundraiser. Arthur nodded politely. I understand completely. His eyes moved toward me again. However, the matter cannot wait until morning. Daniel set his drink down carefully onto the marble counter. I noticed his fingers trembling slightly for the first time all evening. Arthur, he said quietly, what is this about? Arthur unlatched the briefcase slowly while several nearby guests pretended not to listen. Earlier this week, he began calmly, my office received notice regarding preliminary refinancing inquiries tied to this property. Vanessa's expression froze almost invisibly beside the champagne table. As trustee representative for Richard Carter's estate, Arthur continued, I was legally obligated to review those inquiries personally. Silence deepened around us. The jazz music drifting softly through ceiling speakers suddenly sounded strangely distant. Daniel glanced toward Vanessa quickly before looking back at Arthur. It was just exploratory paperwork, he muttered. Arthur removed several folders from the briefcase with careful movements. Unfortunately, Mr. Carter, the inquiries raised concerns because this property cannot legally be refinanced, transferred, or restructured without Mrs. Evelyn Carter's direct written authorization. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the entire room seemed suspended in stillness. Vanessa laughed softly then. Too softly. I am sorry, she said, smiling tightly. But I think there is confusion regarding ownership. Arthur turned toward her politely. There is no confusion, Mrs. Carter. He opened one document and adjusted his glasses beneath the warm chandelier lighting. According to the irrevocable trust established by Richard Carter in 2017, Mrs. Evelyn Carter remains the controlling financial interest holder of this property. I watched the color slowly leave Vanessa's face. Around us, guests exchanged quick, uncertain glances over crystal glasses and linen napkins. Nobody moved toward the dining room anymore. Nobody cared about the fundraiser now. Daniel stared at Arthur as though hearing another language entirely. What does that mean exactly? He asked quietly. Arthur's tone remained professional. It means the property legally remains protected under your mother's controlling ownership authority. He paused briefly before adding, any attempt to alter title structure without her approval would be invalid. Vanessa folded her arms tightly across her waist. That cannot be right, she said immediately. Daniel and I have been paying the mortgage for years. Arthur nodded once. Partial mortgage contributions do not override trust protections. Partial. Such a small word. Yet I noticed several guests glance subtly toward me after hearing it. Vanessa's polished confidence had begun cracking visibly now. This is absurd, she snapped quietly. Daniel inherited this house from his father. Arthur looked at her steadily. No, Mrs. Carter. Daniel inherited residency rights and future financial interests under very specific conditions. He closed the folder gently. The house itself was protected primarily for Evelyn Carter. I remained silent beside the kitchen island while candlelight flickered softly against polished marble countertops I helped pay for years ago. Across the room, Daniel finally looked directly at me. Really looked at me for the first time in a very long while. Not downstairs. Not background. Not useful. Present. His face looked pale beneath the chandelier light. Mom, he whispered, almost sounding embarrassed now for entirely different reasons. I said nothing. There was nothing left to explain. Vanessa stepped closer toward Arthur with visible irritation tightening every word. Why were we never informed about any of this? Arthur's expression barely changed. You were informed repeatedly during initial estate review meetings after Richard Carter's passing. Daniel closed his eyes briefly then. Just briefly. That tiny movement told me everything. He knew. Maybe not every legal detail. Maybe not every clause. But enough. Enough to stay silent while Vanessa treated me like temporary inconvenience instead of family. One of the guests near the dining room cleared his throat awkwardly. Another quietly set down her untouched champagne flute. The atmosphere inside the beautiful house had changed completely now. The orchids still smelled expensive. The candles still glowed softly against imported linens. But the performance underneath everything had collapsed. Vanessa looked around the room quickly, finally realizing everyone had heard enough to understand exactly what kind of evening this had become. "I think this conversation should happen privately," she said sharply. Arthur nodded immediately. "Normally, I would agree." He returned the papers carefully into his briefcase. However, given the public nature of tonight's event and the active financial inquiries submitted recently, I believed immediate clarification was necessary. Clarification. Another elegant legal word for truth arriving at inconvenient moments. Daniel ran one trembling hand through his hair while staring down at the floor. I had not seen him look this lost since Richard died. For one strange second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the basement room beneath this beautiful house. The side entrances. The missing photographs. The careful introductions. The grocery store. Upstairs laughter from weeks earlier while discussing assisted living arrangements like I was furniture needing relocation. Vanessa's voice softened suddenly beside me. "Evelyn," she began carefully, "if there has been some misunderstanding between us." "There has not," I interrupted quietly. My voice surprised even me. Calm. Steady. Final. Vanessa stopped speaking immediately. The room remained completely silent, waiting for something louder. Some dramatic explosion. But age teaches women certain things. One of them is this. The quietest truths usually leave the deepest wounds. I folded my hands lightly in front of me and looked around the crowded room one last time. "I spent years believing I was becoming invisible because I was getting older," I said softly. "Tonight helped me realize something different." Daniel looked up slowly. I met his eyes without anger now. Only clarity. People only become invisible when others stop treating them like family. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Somewhere beyond the rain-streaked windows. Outside, cold October wind rustled through dark maple trees while inside the beautiful house Richard and I helped build, the silence finally belonged to me instead of them. The fundraiser ended earlier than anyone expected. By 10 o'clock, the catering staff quietly packed untouched desserts into cardboard containers while guests gathered coats and exchanged stiff, polite goodbyes near the foyer. Nobody mentioned the trust paperwork directly. Wealthy people rarely discuss humiliation out loud. They simply leave early and remember everything forever. I stood alone beside the kitchen island watching candlelight flicker across half-empty champagne glasses while Vanessa moved through the room thanking guests with a strange smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore. Daniel barely spoke at all after Arthur left. He wandered through the evening like someone walking through the ruins of a house he did not realize was burning until smoke reached the windows. Around 11:30, the last car finally disappeared down the long driveway. Silence settled slowly through the house once the front door closed. Real silence this time. Not the careful, polished, quiet Vanessa preferred during parties. Heavy silence. Honest silence. Vanessa stood near the dining room table removing orchid arrangements one vase at a time with sharp, impatient movements. Her mascara remained perfect, but the careful elegance she carried all evening had cracked around the edges. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter staring into a glass of untouched bourbon. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Then finally Vanessa set down a crystal vase too hard against the table. "I cannot believe Arthur embarrassed us like that in front of everyone," she snapped. Daniel looked up slowly. Tired. Pale. Older than 42 suddenly. "Arthur did not embarrass us," he said quietly. Vanessa laughed once in disbelief. "Oh, please, Daniel." No, his voice remained calm, but firmer now. "He did not." The room fell silent again. I stood near the staircase with my cardigan folded over one arm, suddenly feeling very far away from both of them despite standing only feet apart. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "So now? This is somehow my fault." Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. "You kept pushing the refinance issue. Because we needed clarity." "No," he interrupted softly. "You wanted control." Vanessa stared at him in visible shock. Probably because it was the first truly honest thing he had said in years. "I was trying to protect our future," she replied sharply. Daniel looked toward me then. Really looked at me. And this time there was no distraction in his eyes. No phone. No avoidance. Just shame sitting heavily across his face. Mom, he said quietly. I did not know about the controlling interest part. I believed him. Not completely innocent, but not fully informed either. Vanessa handled details. Vanessa managed appearances. Vanessa moved through life like someone constantly rearranging furniture until every room reflected exactly what she wanted others to see. Daniel simply learned how to stop asking questions because comfort is easier than confrontation. I walked slowly toward the kitchen sink where someone had abandoned a half-empty champagne flute beside folded linen napkins. You knew enough? I answered softly. He lowered his eyes immediately. That hurt him more than yelling ever could have. Vanessa stepped forward quickly. Evelyn, I think everyone is exhausted tonight and emotions are high. Exhausted. Emotional. Difficult. The same soft words used over and over whenever older women become inconveniently truthful. I turned toward her calmly. You were not tired when you introduced me as hired help. Her face lost color instantly. Daniel looked sharply toward Vanessa. What? She opened her mouth immediately. It was a joke. No, I said quietly. It was not. Silence spread through the kitchen again. Outside, rain still tapped softly against the windows while wind carried dead leaves across the dark front lawn. Vanessa's voice dropped lower now. Defensive. Cold. I apologized for that already. No, I replied gently. You explained it away. That is different. Daniel stared at his wife with an expression I had not seen before. Not anger exactly. Recognition. Like someone finally noticing cracks spreading across glass they spent years pretending was perfect. Vanessa shook her head sharply. I cannot do this tonight. Then she walked upstairs without another word, heels striking hardwood steps one hard click at a time until the bedroom door closed somewhere above us. The house became very quiet after that. Daniel remained standing near the kitchen counter, holding the same untouched drink. I never wanted you to feel unwanted here, he said finally. I smiled sadly at that because sometimes people say the cruelest things without realizing it. Daniel, I answered softly, feeling unwanted does not happen all at once. I picked up one of the folded linen napkins and ran my fingers slowly across the embroidered edge. It happens little by little. A changed seat at dinner. Family photographs disappearing. Being asked to stay downstairs while guests visit. His eyes filled immediately with the kind of guilt people carry when they finally stop lying to themselves. I should have said something sooner, he whispered. Yes, I said simply. He looked around the beautiful kitchen then. The marble counters. The orchids. The expensive lighting fixtures glowing warmly above us. Everything polished. Everything impressive. Yet somehow the house had never felt emptier. What happens now? He asked quietly. I thought about that for a long moment before answering. Upstairs, I could hear drawers opening and closing sharply while Vanessa packed anger into neat little movements. Somewhere deep inside the walls, pipes rattled softly as the heat turned on against the cold October night. Tomorrow morning, I said calmly. I am leaving. Daniel stared at me in shock. Mom, you do not have to, I know. I folded the napkin carefully and placed it beside the sink. That is why I can leave peacefully. He looked devastated suddenly. Like a little boy again standing in the bakery kitchen after dropping an entire tray of fresh pastries onto the floor. But this mess could not be cleaned up with apologies and paper towels. Some things break quietly over years. I found a small townhouse near Lake Geneva last month. I continued softly. 2 bedrooms. A little porch facing the water. Daniel swallowed hard. You already planned this? I nodded once. I think part of me knew long before tonight. Tears gathered in his eyes then, but I did not move to comfort him. Loving someone does not always mean protecting them from the consequences of their silence. He stepped closer slowly. I am sorry, he whispered. And for the first time in years, he sounded completely honest. I looked at my son standing in the kitchen, Richard, and I helped build for him and realized something painful but necessary. The saddest part was never being treated like a servant by Vanessa. The saddest part was watching my own son become comfortable with it. I touched his arm gently before turning toward the basement stairs one final time. Good night, Daniel, I said softly. Upstairs, rain pressed against the windows while downstairs my packed suitcase waited quietly beside the bed in the little room where I had spent years learning the difference between being needed and being loved.